Whenever you're ready. I don't know. Yeah. Okay. Hello. Good night, everyone. Happy to be here. My name is Michael Opsangtempa, and for those of you whom I'm meeting for the first time, uh, some of my calling cards, I guess, are that I'm a Tibetan Buddhist translator and interpreter. I was a Tibetan Buddhist monk for about 10 years and then returned to the lay status last year. I've spent a lot of time with Tibetan teachers in the Himalayan region, in Nepal and India, and have studied with them in the West across multiple regions as well. And I've been encouraged by some of my teachers to facilitate sessions on this material. I don't want to use the word teach because that's actually a very tall order in this tradition, but to share some of this in a very practical manner. And sometimes that entails sharing this material in a more secular approach for people who are not at all interested in hearing about Buddhism proper and karma and rebirth and all these sorts of things. And sometimes that means sharing this in a traditional format, which is kind of what we're looking at this night and in this 10-part course, because usually, very fortunately, people who are open to yoga are also open to pretty much everything else in a way, which I don't mean in a bad way. It's not just about expansion of consciousness through different substances and so forth. It's also about, exploring the deeper dimensions of existence, which is very exciting and very interesting in terms of how that exploration can lead us to hopefully greater degrees of happiness and well-being. So the text that we are supposed to cover in these 10 sessions is a list of instructions on how to transform our mind in a very, very, very profound way, so as to first experience greater degrees of well-being through being better able to deal with our problems and challenges that we meet in daily life. That's kind of the first level that we're aiming for. And then in the long run, this text is also organized in a way which would ideally allow us to attain full awakening. So go all the way up to the highest state of psychological evolution that is envisioned as possible in the Tibetan psychological tradition. So we're looking at something that is quite deep and profound in a way because, just these 2 pages, and that's how we have it here in terms of our printout, and I've shared the link in the chat for the digital version of the same text and the same translation. Just these 2 pages can lead me all the way to awakening, kind of sign me up, because I've seen that Buddhists have many books, and some of the traditional sources in the Tibetan tradition include 108 volumes of the Buddha's own teachings. Then on top of that, 220 volumes of the treatises written by the greatest Indian masters. And then on top of that, you have multiple thousands of volumes written by Tibetans to clarify all of that. And then, of course, now that's the entirety of the Buddhist tradition is being slowly transmitted in the global world, or in the globalized West. We also have modern-day books written by pretty much everyone who wants to do that kind of thing. Sometimes they're extremely qualified. Sometimes these are just people who are enthusiastic about these topics. So there's a huge profusion of material on all of this, and it is naturally quite easy to get a little bit disoriented with regards to all of it because, wow, there's so much. So what do I start with, and what's the most quintessential thing to study? Sometimes I might be drawn to a particular element just in terms of my specific disposition, because some people naturally gravitate towards the practices of kindness, compassion, generosity, that side. Some people are truly into exploring the true nature of reality, discovering the truth, seeing emptiness, solving koans, breaking through into something. Sometimes people feel attracted to just being in the here and now, enjoying the present moment, truly finding the joy in each moment of our existence. Some people are truly into the elaborate philosophical presentations and all the mind games that can go there. And I use the word, this phrase in a very positive way, because that's where we can flex the muscles of our intellect to see whether we can crack the code of reality, so to say. And some people like things to be very simple, They don't like elaborate philosophy. They just want a very simple practice that would still deliver the results. Some people are into mantras and visualizations and meditational deities and having very elaborate imagery around them. Some people like the physical movement because there are physical yogas in Buddhism as well, and the yogas associated with breathing and so forth. This is just like, there's a lot. And here, these great masters that have transmitted this specific tradition, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit to kind of identify the roots of these practices, they have codified the most quintessential elements that we can apply in our practice and made this list of very practical suggestions. So in this specific translation that we're going to be relying on over the course of the next 10 meetings, we have the verses or the words of the root text itself, and annotations added here very helpfully by the translator, in this case Dr. Alex Berzin, who's one of the senior translators in our tradition and one of my own teachers as well. So the annotations, the added elements, are in square brackets. They're just to clarify some of the points that would otherwise appear to be too cryptic. You know, what the hell does that even mean? 3 this, 4 that, 2 this. It's very confusing sometimes. So he's adding these points just to remind us of what they actually mean based on the commentaries on all of this. And there are hundreds of commentaries on this text that exist, and at least a few dozen are translated into English as well. But other than that, it's just the root text itself, very terse in terms of the wording, and therefore requiring commentary and sort of an experiential transmission, ideally, which I will in no way be able to deliver, since I have no qualities, no knowledge, no understanding, no anything. But because I have received teachings on this text on multiple occasions, full transmission of this with very elaborate commentary at least 4 times, and then multiple times commentaries on specific parts of this text, because it's sometimes broken into parts and just a specific part is used. Because I've been able to receive all of that and serve as an interpreter for those teachings, or the translator sometimes for the written stuff, I'll try to very accurately convey the explanations that I've been able to receive, and on occasion add a personal story or two just to illustrate it and to make it come alive, but hopefully not distorting anything in this beautiful material. And as it is to be expected, because the text is quite elaborate, we can receive the benefit from attending even 1 class or 2 potentially, because even one of these so-called mind training slogans can be used on its own. But also, if we sit through the whole thing, or if we eventually watch all the recordings or listen to all the recordings, and then maybe read a couple of commentaries that are published as books, and then maybe keep revisiting it throughout our own life, we are quite honestly then endowed with a practice that can carry us through all the stages leading to awakening. And therefore, there is that tradition of receiving teachings on texts like this multiple times. Some masters have received teachings on texts like this more than 100 times, and then read commentaries on such texts multiple hundreds of times as well. Why? Because each time we revisit it, if we are practicing from this point of view of the beginner's mind, as it's called in the Zen tradition, where we are trying to see it all in a fresh manner, and then again and again reapply it to our experience, from that point of view, there is certainly a lot of power in this. But before we go into the actual text itself, and tonight we might be able to cover 2 lines or 1 line and a half, we'll see how it goes. We'll do a little preliminary meditation, and then we'll do a couple more meditations later today as well, just to make it all very practical, very experiential. But also just want to say that on one occasion I had the fortune of serving as an interpreter for one of my teachers who was teaching a specific part of this text, just 4 lines from it. And he spent about 60 sessions teaching those 4 lines. So it can be stretched into infinity, or it can be packed into 1 night, the whole of it. But we kind of thought, well, maybe 10 sessions is elaborate enough so that we see, oh, these practices are associated with this line, these practices associated with this line, this is how to do these ones, this is how to do these ones. But 10 meetings is still doable. In a way, it's kind of like an actual course that you're attending. But the text itself is also a course in that it describes specific stages of our development. And the only problem there is that we should not expect our mind to evolve at the pace through which we're going to be going through the text. So just because we have reached a line which talks about very profound realizations in our third meeting does not mean that we would already actually mentally be there by the third meeting. So I just want to give the heads up. That being said, of course, there are always some people who are extremely naturally gifted. They are exceptional individuals, usually like 1 in a billion. And so someone might end up being enlightened by the end of this course. And, you know, kudos on that. You know, cheers, mate. Great. Leave a positive review for the Sangha Yoga School then. It's brilliant. Beautiful. But outside of that, we will at least plant some very firm seeds, hopefully, and see how to apply a lot of this material. Plus, we're recording everything, so I will make a little web page where you will be able to download all the meditations that we did together and the recordings of all the sessions and see some of the things that you can read on the side, some of the commentaries that are good to visit. So it will give you kind of a collection of stuff to use in your own practice. And that will keep you busy, you know, so for some time, and then we'll see what else to do, right? But for now, we'll start with the preliminary meditation that is just about discovering our goals, aspirations, and wishes with regards to our well-being, because this text, just like the entirety of the Buddhist path, is all about happiness and suffering, removing suffering and gaining happiness or uncovering happiness. So we'll do a form of loving kindness meditation, which combines loving kindness itself, and loving kindness is defined as the wish for beings to be happy and have the causes of happiness. So we're cultivating that wish. But it's combined here with an intelligent exploration with regards to our deepest desires, deepest aspirations, deepest goals. So something that is resting quite deep within us and is associated with genuine flourishing, genuine well-being. So we'll try to explore that in this guided meditation, which combines a use of our imagination, our analytical abilities, with just generating that push, that aspiration for greater well-being and happiness, which is defined as loving kindness in this tradition. So please find a comfortable stationary position. People meditate in all sorts of positions, and in Buddhism we sometimes say you can meditate while lying down. So if you want to go into the Shavasana posture, perfectly doable. You can sit up in a comfortable position with your spine more or less straight and your legs comfortably crossed, or if you're sitting on a chair, listening at home, you can place your feet flat on the ground and just rest like that. And of course, if our body has unique needs and we want to be in a position that is uniquely suitable for us personally, that's also absolutely fine. But what we do is we adopt that position and then we spend some moments exploring the sensations arising in the body. We allow our awareness to descend into the body, all the way down to the parts of the body that are in contact with the ground. Noticing the physical sensations associated with the earth element that's holding us. The sensations of firmness and stability, perhaps experienced in the area of our feet or the outer side of our legs, in our buttocks, in our lower back perhaps. And while touching the earth with our awareness in this manner, noticing how firmly it is holding us, we allow these parts of our body to start releasing physical tension. to the degree that's available to us, undoing the knots of tension in our feet and toes. Across our legs. In our pelvic floor. Then our lower back and our abdominal area. In our chest, the area of the shoulders. Establishing a profound sense of stillness in our hands and fingers as well. Relaxing the muscles of the face. And then just extending our awareness to the entirety of the body field. Noticing the sensations associated with the process of breathing. And resting with them for a little while in a state of curious observation. And then with our body resting like that, we will explore 4 questions related to our genuine well-being or our potential flourishing. And for each of these questions, the answer that we're looking for is more of a general vision, general idea, intuitive understanding, rather than simply a list of words. But if some words come, that's fine as well. And the first question here is, how do I personally envision my potential genuine flourishing? Genuine well-being that I would like to one day attain. Allowing a certain vision that would combine outer factors and inner factors related to our mind to emerge, even if it is still quite vague. And then generating the wish of loving kindness by aspiring, may it be so. May I realize my heart's desire. May I reach this genuine state of flourishing. For a little while, we can even imagine ourselves truly being in that state of genuine well-being already, as if to see how would that feel from the inside. Then, related to that, for the second question, we can ask ourselves, what types of support and resources do I need from the world around me in order to progress towards this genuine well-being? Once again, allowing a certain vision, certain general idea, or maybe even some words to emerge in our mind as the answer. And then responding to that answer with the wish of, may it be so. May I truly receive these types of support and resources. In order to eventually gain genuine well-being. And breathing naturally, we can even use the process of our inhalation to imagine drawing these necessary types of support closer to ourselves so that we can receive and accept them. Then for a little while imagining that we have actually received all of these types of support, all these resources that we need. And then for the third question, asking ourselves, how do I need to transform, to change, to evolve in order to arrive at that state of genuine flourishing? Not out of self-aversion, but in terms of allowing my true potential to emerge, to be uncovered. What do I need to change in terms of my habitual patterns, my skills, my qualities? Once again, allowing a certain understanding, general idea, vision to emerge. This conventional level understanding of a strategy that we might want to employ to transform ourselves. And then generating the wish of, may it be so. Offering ourselves kindness and wishing for this transformation to occur naturally and smoothly. And if we wish, we can even use both the in-breath and the out-breath to imagine transforming step by step. Gradually changing. And then even imagining that we have transformed in this manner, uncovering our potential, removing obscuring factors, strengthening the positive ones. And finally asking ourselves, in this vision of genuine flourishing and well-being, what gift or gifts can I offer to the world, to other beings, to all who live? And then wishing, may it be so. May I indeed offer this gift to all who live. Imagining, if we wish, that they're all receiving this positive influence, that the sphere of their experiences is transformed because of that, and they gain greater happiness and well-being. And that the entirety of interdependence is therefore changed as well. And then allowing this imagery, along with the wishes, aspirations, and so forth, to dissolve in our mind, and for a little while leaving our mind in a state of spacious clarity, with no particular reference point. And then, noticing the appearances of our body, the experiences of the tactile sensations, the contact with the ground, the process of breathing, and very gently introducing some movement to the body by rocking back and forth if we wish, or moving our fingers, activating our facial muscles, and so forth, as we slowly conclude the practice. So hopefully that was kind of trippy and nice in all sorts of ways, and definitely a meaningful practice to do in general, because it combines, once again, loving kindness proper, which is the wish for beings to have happiness and the causes of happiness, in this case directed towards ourselves. So it's self-directed loving kindness, which is the first step on the path of cultivating universal loving kindness. But then the other side of it was an exercise in what, in terms of modern psychology, would be sometimes called cognitive intelligence, or intelligence with regards to our wishes, desires, and aspirations. Conation, or the ability to have wishes, desires, aspirations, goals, intentions, is the least researched aspect of our psyche. So we have a lot of research on emotions, we have a lot of research on cognition, and of course there's a never-ending process of discovering more and more in scientific terms about the way we cognize reality and interpret it and perceive it and so forth. And this is where also neuroscience has a lot to offer in terms of the correlates of our cognitive processes on the neuroscientific, neurophysiological side of things. And then we know a lot about attention these days as well. Originally it was a very mysterious matter. In the late 19th century, when William James was first writing about attention, and he was the biggest writer on the topic at that time, as well as one of the forefathers of modern psychology. William James came to the realization, or a mistaken conclusion perhaps, that attention was not trainable. So upon exploring the topic of attention, he saw that some people were born or raised with higher attentional plasticity. They were better capable, more capable of holding their attention on one object, truly focusing on some process, accomplishing some goals, and others were just naturally distracted. So there was not much hope for them, he thought, and therefore it was just natural to conclude that the people who had greater attentional plasticity, greater attentional stability, were more suited to be in leadership positions, had higher emotional resilience, were better able to just focus on something and get things done. And everyone else could still find little tricks to keep themselves focused, but essentially they would always inevitably be suffering from this mental fleetiness, this fleetiness of our mind, where we open, let's say, that's kind of an outdated example, but it used to really work really well. We open our Facebook page just to answer that one question, just that one message that we have received from someone. And then 40 minutes later, we find ourselves down the rabbit hole of scrolling through the infinite pile of garbage that's being presented to us by the social media platform. And we're kind of just surprised that all this time has disappeared into nothingness, was literally pissed down the toilet, because we have not accomplished the original goal. We have still not answered that message, but we were all over the place with regards to everything else that's being presented there. So what to do then? Oh, just to accept the fact that we're so distracted, so easily distracted, and then maybe, if we wish to, get the official diagnosis of having ADHD, and then maybe take Ritalin or Adderall or something like that, or not. But either way, at least we know what we have, so it's less depressing. At least we have the official diagnosis. So we know a lot more about attention these days because of the incredible meeting between the contemplative traditions, many of them Eastern in nature, so to say, including Buddhism, some branches of Hinduism, the Sufi tradition, the Taoist tradition, and so forth, and modern science, as a result of which, as a result of this meeting, we know that attention is trainable. And so even basic mindfulness techniques can lead to increase in our attentional plasticity. And of course, if we undertake the incredible training feats that these great yogis and yoginis are still undertaking to this day in the Himalayan tradition, where they stay in retreats for decades on end, some of them in lifetime retreat of accumulating 60 years of uninterrupted practice, then even greater degrees or incredible unimaginable degrees of attentional stability are potentially possible. So there's an exploration of all of that and research being done on it, and very interesting dialogue with regards to, well, how did Buddhists use these techniques traditionally, and what's happening now with our scientific research, and how can we introduce this to school children so that they are better suited in terms of attentional skills and so forth. But conation, this last domain of being able to adjust our desires, is the most mysterious field of all, simply because we have not been attending to it quite that deeply. Whereas in the Buddhist tradition, and more specifically in the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, which is the branch that this text is a part of, there's a great emphasis that's placed on generating very specific wishes, strengthening in them to an unbearable level of intensity, and using them to break through certain mental blocks and problems and attain incredible levels of flourishing and happiness. So it turns out that this energy of wishing, of intending, of aspiring can be harnessed. We can use it, we can grab it, we can shape it into different things. We can shape it into very specific wishes that directly contribute to the experience of genuine happiness and incredible levels of bliss. And there are recipes for that, easily available. So some of these recipes are more universal in nature and can be presented on a secular level, and that's why we have quite a lot of material on training in loving kindness and compassion on the secular level, and there's nothing wrong with it, because loving kindness and compassion are specific forms of cognitive energy, desiring energy, wishing energy, and completely universal in that there's interest towards these practices from Christian priests and Catholic nuns, and I've had people from the Sufi tradition ask me about those practices because they wanted to know the specific techniques. And of course, there's no shortage of non-believers who just want to cultivate greater levels of compassion and loving kindness, and also experience greater levels of joy and bliss that comes with that, great levels that come with that. So there's all that available to us. But in this specific text, and in the texts that historically preceded, and then also in the commentaries that stem from this text, there is a presentation of a more specific, more unique type of desiring that is directly connected to the eventual attainment of full awakening, that is not pertinent to the secular level, is not something that would be equally interesting to non-believers, or people who are not interested in spirituality of any kind at all. That's not what they would be into particularly, and is this very technical in terms of how we cultivate these specific types of desiring. But additionally, this text also includes ways of transforming our cognitive habits, so our perception of reality, how do we cognize the world, how do we interpret the world. There's quite a lot of that in this text. There's quite a lot of material on attentional training, so how do I become better focused? How do I overcome my ADHD, essentially? First, how do I overcome the unbearable types of attentional imbalances, the types that make me completely unfunctional? And then how do I slowly cultivate greater and greater degrees of stability, so deeply settled that simply resting in them is completely reinvigorating for my body and mind. And now, according to some brilliant research done by Elissa Epel and some other experts, not simply invigorating for the body and mind in general, but also deeply healing for ourselves, deeply wholesome with regards to our DNA activity and the way our telomeres work and so forth. This, once again, magnificent research on how meditation can affect all of that, and simply resting in these profound states of attentional stillness and stability. So there's material on that in this text as well, and obviously also lots of tricks for how to deal with our emotions, how to deal with our emotional reactions to whatever is happening in daily life. So all of that is to be slowly explored, and it is for this reason that we can once again take this text apart and see it as 59 or 60 or 58. There's different variations of this text. So sometimes you will have 59 slogans, sometimes 60 slogans, some 61, sometimes 57, you know, more or less. So we could take it apart and just have 58 cards or 59 cards with individual recipes for daily disasters. We just take a random card, we look at it, and then we say, oh yeah, well, that is actually helping me to deal with the trauma of today, with the heartbreaks of today, of this specific day, where I've been not feeling particularly good emotionally. Could be used that way, absolutely, and can also be used as a step-by-step presentation of the path to awakening that is quite advanced in nature, but that would, if we keep going through it on an endless loop, just repeating the cycle, repeating the cycle, repeating the cycle, take us deeper and deeper and deeper towards the deepest levels of our awareness, closer and closer and closer towards our magnificent radiant nature that is seen as a given in this tradition, so that eventually we become not simply great human beings, which is one result of practicing mind training teachings or attitude training teachings, but would also eventually allow us to experience the full psychological awakening, full psychological flourishing. So within all of that, as I've said, we usually explore these texts step by step, line by line, and it usually begins with a title. And once again, I've one time had the fortune of translating for one of my teachers, and a few dozen sessions were just spent on the title. It's not going to happen in our case, but even studying the title or looking at the title already gives us so much information. So in this case, the title is 7-Point Attitude Training, or Lojong Dongduma in Tibetan, Lojong Dongduma. So last time, when we had a session on the 8 verses of attitude training or mind training, we very briefly covered this idea of attitude training or mind training itself. So we have 2 Tibetan roots there. First of all, the word lojong itself is quite frequently used in English as well as a borrowed Tibetan term because it's pithy and it points straight at these teachings and at a specific genre of texts. So when you hear the words lojong texts, you immediately know that these would be texts that deal with attitude training, with mind training. This is a specific genre presenting these instructions. And these lojong texts would always be practical instructions. They would always be quite pithy, even though there are some that are more elaborate, especially the commentarial texts. You can have a whole book on this specific text that's more elaborate. That's a hefty book that you can be carrying around with you. But in that hefty book, there would always be some very, very pithy points that you can apply immediately. And therefore, it's not a text that is simply historical in nature or philosophical. This is not simply a gathering of interesting ideas, a collection of interesting ideas. This is something that needs to be applied, usually sometimes something that's quite inspiring for people in terms of seeing, oh, well, if I could only embody this specific point, it would truly transform the fabric of my entire life. And I would be a different person, living a different life. So it would increase the subjective, raise the subjective quality of my life, and by extension also make me a more pleasant person to be around. That's great. So this is the dual benefit of applying these teachings. So it's a genre, but the genre itself comes from the fact that these are specific teachings, the specific type of teaching. Texts are simply these teachings being written down. So somebody took these teachings and eventually put them to writing, and then they were transmitted and copied and preserved and then published and then translated and then translated again. There's dozens of translations of this root text, and therefore they exist as something that we can be working with physically or digitally And because these beautiful texts themselves carry the teachings that are transformative and liberating and so forth, the Tibetan cultural tradition pays great respect to the texts as being more sacred than the statues, than the images of the Buddha, and so forth. So today I was translating for Chikanyim Rinpoche, who was giving wonderful teachings about the foundational aspects of the path in Austria, and it was like a big online broadcast, and a bunch of translators from all over the world, trying to offer something while the Zoom connection keeps breaking up and stuff like that. And amongst other things, he mentioned that in Tibet, where Tibetans would come across even a piece of paper that would have the syllable na on it, or the syllable shi. Syllable na means disease. Syllable shi means death. But even if they would be walking and on the road they would see a little piece of paper that said disease, or death, they would pick up that piece of paper and they would touch their crown with it as a sign of great respect. And they would also place that piece of paper somewhere in a respectful way, so on a shelf or on a table, somewhere. So it's not on the ground because, God forbid, that's a piece of the Dharma itself. But the words disease or death, they would take that as a pith instruction, as a reminder that for as long as we're existing in the unawakened samsaric reality, we're vulnerable to sickness, so we would keep getting sick. And of course, death is something inevitable for us. So, good reminder. Thanks, piece of paper. I'll place you in somewhere where it would be respectful. And I would especially treat texts like this with the greatest possible respect of seeing them as our teachers. On one occasion, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was giving teachings on this great text called the Way to the Bodhisattva's Entry to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. It's a great, incredible composition by Shantideva, one of the greatest poets in Buddhist history. And when His Holiness was teaching this text, there was a question and answer session, and one of my Dharma friends came up to the microphone and asked, well, what do I do? What can I do for you to become my teacher, Your Holiness? How can I become a student of the Dalai Lama? And although technically when you take an actual teaching and a transmission and an empowerment from someone, you automatically establish that teacher and student connection, instead of pointing that out and saying, well, you are kind of technically already my student or something like that, which is not something the Dalai Lama would ever do, he said, oh, well, actually it would be most wise to take this text by Shantideva as your teacher. That's your actual teacher in daily life. You can open it, you can read it, you can study it, you can embody it. So it will keep taking you through all the stages, whereas I'm just a human person. So kind of that attitude towards this being a window into all the stages of the practice, and also serving as a mirror for our own mind, because when these explanations on specifically the attitude training are given, when these teachings are transmitted, it is very often what often happens is that when we're hearing about all these different ways of becoming more patient and compassionate and open and empathetic and so forth, the first thought that comes to mind is, wow, my husband really needs to hear this. Wow, if only my boss heard that. And she would really benefit from hearing this. And then what we need to say is, oh no, I'm the one who needs to hear this. The problem is right here. And the fact that I started pointing fingers upon hearing about greater patience and empathy and so forth already shows me that there's still a lot to work on. So that's kind of a tricky or funny thing that almost always tends to happen in these circumstances, but then allows us to look back at ourselves and say, oh, no. No. This is a mirror for my face first. And then I can inspire others with my transformative example by becoming a better human being. But I'm not to go around and be like, here, you need this. Girl, you really need this, Practice with this. It's not that. It's looking at this as a mirror for our own mind. And even the title here says that we can undertake lojong, or attitude training, attitude transformation, mind training. So the word law in Tibetan has multiple connotations, but they all revolve around our mind. So it can mean, in some cases, intellect, as in our ability to be intelligent and discerning. In some cases, it can mean attitude, our attitude towards something. What's my attitude towards other people? What's my attitude towards planet Earth? What's my attitude towards these kinds of experiences? It can simply mean mind, and in some cases it can also mean dualistic mind, as opposed to the non-dual pristine awareness that's at the very heart of our being. But in the context of these teachings, it's more along the lines of attitude. What attitudes do we have towards ourselves, towards others, towards experiences, towards the situations that we go through? And then Zhong can mean training, or purification, or refining, or refinement. And the idea here is that we can take our shitty attitudes, or unenlightened attitudes, or miserable attitudes, pitiful attitudes, I'm so horrible, or I'm so lonely, or I'm so low quality no one would ever love me. We can take all of those attitudes, including the attitude of being superior to others, and transform them. And transform them into something that is more in touch with reality, and therefore is less insane, in that, from the Buddhist point of view, the more out of touch with reality we are, the more we suffer. The more in touch with reality we are, the happier we are going to be. So it's this movement towards reality, attuning our attitudes towards reality, that is implied in the very word lojong itself. So we can take the energy that is now configured, the mental energy that is now configured as our habitual attitudes, and reshape it. And it's this yoga of lojong. In the same way that we can reshape our breath when are undertaking pranayamas, pranavyayamas, in the same way that we can reshape the physical energy that this body is made from, or made of, we can reshape, and in the same way in some psychological trainings, we can reshape the energy of our emotions into something more meaningful and constructive. Here we are primarily reshaping our attitudes, the energy that is bound in these attitudes. And then the 7 points, that's the other part of the title, are the 7 points that we have in the text. It's fairly straightforward. And amongst these 7 points, the second one is the very heart of the text. The first one prepares us for this very heart. And points 3 through 7 offer additional assistance. So the most difficult point to practice, in a way, and the one that takes the most time to master, the ones that the very heart of the path, in a way, and the point of it all, is the second one, the actual training in bodhicitta, as it says here, because points 3 through 7 support that. In different ways, they offer additional miscellaneous practices that we can do. They offer criteria for how to understand whether our attitudes have been refined and tamed, and so forth. And the first point offers us incredibly important preparation, or preliminary practices that are necessary for us to actually succeed in the training that's described in point 2. But before that, so we have covered the title, 2 more important considerations here. One of them is about the authorship of this text and the lineage that brought it to us. Another is about the so-called praise at the very beginning that opens the text for us. So with regards to the authorship of the text and the teachers that have created these beautiful teachings, or kind of envisioned them, packed them in this manner, and then transmitted them to us, if you ever attend a classical Tibetan teaching, a Tibetan teaching presented in the very, very traditional manner, you would not have a bunch of people sitting on the floor of the yoga club, but you would have huge crowds of devoted followers gathered to receive the transmission. And then what would naturally happen is that you would have some listening very devotedly, but you would also have some families starting a picnic right there while the teachings are going on. You would have like them drinking tea and sometimes even saying things that are a bit more activating. and eating bread and playing with the children, the teaching children are being rowdy, and sometimes there would even be a little bit of fighting going on if you have some Kampas or Eastern Tibetans there who are very hot-blooded cowboys, and you stepped on my clock, I'm gonna, and there's a little bit of stabbing going on occasionally. It's like wild, wild west in a way. Traditionally, you would have all of that happening, but at the heart of it, closer to where the Lama would be teaching, you would have devotees attending to every word. And the Lama would start by first describing how they have received this transmission. And then for many of these teachings, they would also describe the history of it. And this goes against the colonial notions of us feeling, now in the West when we're receiving these teachings and reading these books and doing these practices, the colonial notion of us feeling like, yeah, that's valuable material, but these guys really didn't know what they were doing with it. These were gems in the hands of barbarians. And now we're going to take those gems and extract them and play with them, and we're going to teach the world what Buddhism is really all about. Plain mindfulness, naked awareness, something like that. And all this Tibetan stuff and all these Tibetans, yeah, who needs that? That's quite a common attitude, honestly, and is as common as any other type of colonialism that, or arrogant colonialism that we can encounter. Whereas for Tibetans, when they would be presenting, and I'm in no way trying to glorify Tibetan culture above any other culture in the world, but the traditional attitude towards Dharma teachings there would be, we have received this incredible gift that was transmitted through multiple generations of practitioners who were working with this material to truly embody it. So it was generation upon generation upon generation of master mind benders, master attitude benders. So in the same way that in the Avatar universe, you have firebenders and airbenders and so forth. Here we're talking about people who were master attitude benders. They were shaping their attitudes in forms that grant happiness to themselves and others. So very, very hands-on training there needs to be there, right? For that skill to be transmitted from one person to another. And before that, all of these teachings on attitude training or attitude bending came from the great Indian masters of the past. And not just Indian, because some of them were living in areas closer to Afghanistan. There is a great master that lived in Indonesia who is crucial for this specific lineage of transmission, and so forth. Some of the texts were translated into Tibetan from Chinese, so first from Sanskrit to Chinese, then to Tibetan. Some texts were actually written in China and translated into Tibetan, even though there's not that many of those. So yeah, people in the general area, but so many people to be grateful to for their incredible contributions, not simply intellectual, but also practical. They have taken their time to embody all of this. So these are the names of these masters, one after the other. And these are their life stories. And that's how they did their attitude bending all the way up until our very own time. And it would always start with either the historical Buddha or some trans-historical Buddhas that existed in the time beyond time, far, far away. What does it Star Wars start with? Long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, something like that. Long ago in a galaxy far, far away. So some stories kind of, some lineage of transmission go there in the time beyond time. But eventually they come all the way down to our immediate teachers. And even in their own lives, we can see this incredible attitude bending as well, how they transformed their attitudes towards situations and emerged victorious in terms of cultivating great levels of compassion, empathy, love, wisdom, and so forth. And I think I mentioned this the last time we were looking at attitude training. But there are some incredible examples that are alive in this world today, partly because we are witnessing the incredible decimation of Tibetan culture and the genocide of the Tibetan people, and quite a few masters that are famous, but also, of course, numerous masters that do not have that worldwide fame, but have truly transformed their minds in powerful ways, have undergone years of torture, have been to concentration camps, have been tortured to the degree where their bodies are not functioning properly at all, but their minds emerged in an incredible state of wholesome, non-traumatized clarity and brilliance. So I personally have had the great fortune of receiving teachings from two masters who have both spent multiple years in concentration camps. One of them was Yangtang Rinpoche, who passed away 2 or 3 years ago. Another one is Garchen Rinpoche, who's still alive today, teaching in Arizona, one of the greatest lamas in this world. And both of them spent years in concentration camps and were tortured and experienced other. You can imagine. You know, I'm not going to even give a list of what goes on in concentration camps or what happened in 1959 and after that. But emerging from that and not being so deeply PTSD that we're unable to function is a very interesting feat. Because when I think back to my own traumatic situations, the things that I've gone through, and then I look at how my nervous system reacts to different stimuli and how I now feel about certain things. Yes, there is a lot of cushioning that happened because of my Dharma practice, so I wasn't as maybe damaged as I would have been otherwise, but still not completely unscathed. But these great lamas, when I'm interacting with them, when I'm seeing them, when I see how they deal with people, how they respond to stimuli, how they talk, how they walk, how they teach, that's some crazy stuff. And crazy in the most beautiful sense of that word. They're not displaying any signs of PTSD. They're beyond that for some reason. And not because they're doing spiritual bypass. That's not at all the case. It's because they have found something that is truly transformative. And for most of them, it was all quintessentialized into such teachings as this one. For many of them, it was this very teaching. So thinking back to this beautiful lineage, and we could have a few sessions just talking about these specific lamas one after another, but we only have 10 classes, so we're not. Yeah, maybe next time. So we're not going to do that, but still, it's worthwhile to say that there were different lamas in ancient India, different teachers, some of them monastic, some of them non-monastic, who came up with different approaches to attitude bending, attitude training. And there were three specific teachers, Dharmarakshita, Maitri Yogi, and Serlingpa, as Tibetans call him, or Guru from Suvarnadvipa in Indonesia, that developed especially potent approaches that were kind of all the rage in ancient India, in that when the great master Atisha, who is the person who brought these teachings to Tibet, was looking around India and trying to find the most notable examples of these mind training techniques, he specifically singled out those three. We have their writings still existent. Dharmarakshita's text on karma, the will of sharp weapons, is taught quite a lot. Maitri Yogi's texts exist, but they're not covered that often, even though they are in the collection of his teachings translated into Tibetan and now into English. But the last guru of the three, Serlingpa, the master from the Golden Island, was so exceptional that even though he lived in Indonesia, so that's far away from India, you have to sail there, and sailing back there was not exactly a cruise. It was very, very dangerous. But even though it was a faraway journey, Atisha really thought there was something very special about those instructions that Serlingpa carried. So he took a very long and arduous journey there with lots of dangers, and there are stories about how at some points he had to use his special abilities, to calm down the ocean or to deal with sea monsters, and I don't know. Sounds like kind of very interesting experience, but after almost a year-long journey with all the trials and tribulations, he reached the specific island, Sumatra, I think, where Serlingpa lived, and came to Serlingpa and made a request for these special teachings and received those teachings. And even though Atisha by then was already not only an accomplished philosopher and meditator, but an accomplished tantric siddha, so an accomplished master with extraordinary abilities that he did have to use even to get to Serlingpa. He was already a master capable of, taming reality, taming the five elements, and so forth. He still thought that Serlingpa had something extremely special there. So he went there, he received those teachings, and then after coming to Tibet some years later, when he was invited to Tibet to restore the transmission of Buddhism there, or kind of reinvigorate it, revitalize it, when he would talk about his own teachers and his lamas, and when he would mention Serlingpa, even though Serlingpa was his later day teacher, his eyes would fill with tears. He would always fold his hands together and just be filled with natural devotion. And they describe it as like your hairs standing up on your, your entire body feeling that electric current of an unbearable devotion to someone who has transformed your mind so deeply. Not transformed it through zapping you with lightning, of course, even though sometimes, very rarely, those things do happen. when there's a very strong karmic connection between two people, but transforming them by means of delivering instructions. Because Atisha then took those instructions and practiced with them and embodied them. And then when Atisha came to Tibet, and he passed away in Tibet in 1054, so around 1,000 years ago, he transmitted these to his main Tibetan student, Dramtonpa, who was a layman. He refused to get ordained because he wanted to remain a layperson serving the monastic community, and of course other lay people, but he never wanted to gain the elevated position of being a senior monastic or something like that. He was very humble that way, and passed away later taking care of people with leprosy. Dramtonpa received all these incredible teachings combined by Atisha, transmitted them to his own students, and then a few generations later, and these teachings on mind training were first transmitted from one teacher to one student in secrecy because they're very radical. Eventually, they reached the generation of the author of this specific text, Geshe Chekowa. And Geshe here means virtuous friend. In general, these days in the Tibetan tradition, word Geshe denotes someone who has a specific philosophical degree. It still means virtuous friend, but it's like having the equivalent of a PhD in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. Back in the days of Geshe Chekowa, the word Geshe meant virtuous friend, Kalyana Mitra in Sanskrit. So someone who can truly guide your mind to virtue, a genuinely good teacher imbued with such wisdom and compassion that even hanging out with them makes you more wise and compassionate. That's truly powerful, right? So having that kind of force field of wisdom and compassion plus good advice. Truly powerful. So Geshe Chekowa was one of those. But how did he become a Geshe? How did he transform himself into an embodiment of wisdom and compassion? That happened because he really was passionate about receiving these instructions. And it really took him some time to find the one master, one specific master that still had the transmission, and to request those teachings and kind of fish them out of that master's collection of knowledge and collection of information, because that master was not teaching these things openly. But eventually Geshe Chekowa received those and then committed them to writing. And through that we have this text. There are actually multiple editions of this text, quite different from each other in terms of the order in which these lines are organized. Because sometimes you have, in this case, the presentation of first the deepest nature of reality that we're looking at, and then teachings on how to work with conventional or relative reality. This is the version of the text that we're working with. It's kind of seen as more advanced, so you should feel good about yourselves. But then there are versions of the text in which first we're taught how to deal with the relative aspect of love, kindness, empathy, and so forth, and then we're introduced to the ultimate nature of reality. So those versions exist as well, and there are multiple forms of this, plus multiple commentaries, hundreds of commentaries in Tibetan language, and many modern ones written in English or transcribed and edited and then published in English and other languages. But through this all, the important point here is to think, wow, there is an invisible lineage connecting me all to the Buddha, to these great masters of attitude bending, to Atisha, to Dramtonpa, to Geshe Chekowa, and to the living teachers in this day and age who have transformed their own minds through practicing these teachings. So for example, for me personally, I have received this text from multiple teachers, but the one that I have received this in full form 3 times over and over again, and 2 times I had to translate or interpret for that as well. Slam Alan Wallace, who is of course a first-generation American teacher, but he received it from an incredible Tibetan attitude training master, who was himself a layman and a master of Tibetan medicine, and a Tibetan aristocrat who lost everything during the cultural revolution, well, first the invasion and the occupation of 1950 to 1959, and truly transformed his mind against all those odds, despite all of these adversities. And then that goes back all the way into the past. But there are multiple kind of lineages that come down to us, and when we do meditations on sort of our appreciation for all of this, we would sometimes, and that's an important aspect of traditional practice in this context, supplicate these lineages of transmission and ask for them to bless our mind, which means for them to pour inspiration into our mind so that our mind can be transformed. And that's not something that's frequently taught or done in kind of the Western approach to Dharma in general, to different types of yoga, different types of mental transformation, because you wouldn't walk into an MBSR course, or mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBCT, mindfulness-based cognitive training, and start your session with a prayer to John Kabat-Zinn to bless your mind so that you can become more mindful. And similarly, even in generally speaking, yoga communities, once again, you would not start with kind of a verse of praise to Patanjali. Oh, Patanjali, pour your Guru Kripa into my mind, your Guru blessings into my mind, so that your mercy, so that my mind can be transformed. But there's actually something incredibly powerful about those things, if we are truly open to them. And that's why there are lineage prayers for this teaching. And we will include those in the materials for the course on the page that I'm going to create. And when you do those, you supplicate these great masters of the past and all the attitude benders of the past, kind of all the Jedi of the past, come and bless my mind, pour your inspiring energy into it so that my mind becomes more flexible, so that it's easier to bend those nasty attitudes. And that is a very, very powerful element that becomes absolutely crucial when we're practicing the parts of this text that are related to the ultimate nature of reality, because it is sometimes said that in the highest teachings that are the most simple but not easy to apply, that ultimate simplicity of seeing reality as it is accomplished through two primary factors: horizontal love, or unbearable love and compassion towards all other beings, and vertical love, which is unbearable devotion towards those who have come before us, the windows into the ultimate reality that are our teachers. So we are then taught how to cultivate the two, the horizontal love of universal love and compassion, and the vertical love on this unbearable devotion. And as you can imagine, quote-unquote Westerners are kind of open to the idea of universal love and compassion, even though it's like, oh, I have to be compassionate towards Tories, or Republicans, there's that, but that's kind of, negotiable. Yeah, sure, they have Buddha nature as well. Okay, fine. One day they'll be reborn as people with the same political views. I mean, something like that. Okay, that's the negotiable. But devotion and things like that, we have a lot of trauma around, because of course there's been many, scandals and problems and abuse, and we have a natural aversion to authority, but at the same time we're sometimes longing for it. There's like a big mixture of Freudian horrors. And because of that, it becomes quite difficult for us sometimes to connect to those aspects of these practices. But at the same time, some people are so passionate about those aspects of these practices, they jump straight into being in a cult. So you have people who are completely averse to these things and therefore cannot receive the benefit from them, and people who are so open to them that they lose any common sense and they jump into some unhealthy, abusive relationship, and kind of that's the end of the story as well. So we need to find the balance between the two by very gently exploring these principles and these ideas and these practical methods in a gradual approach that would help us receive the most benefit from them. So we will be mentioning these two types of love, horizontal and vertical, as we go through the lines. So that's on the lineage of transmission. It's quite important to, even if we don't know the individual names and so forth, to just mentally sometimes turn towards these great beings and think, hey, I'm open, I'm open to your blessings, pour them into my mind. And that's really, that brings us to the next line, prostration to great compassion. So that's the praise with which Geshe Chekawa opens the text. In general, in the Tibetan tradition of translating and writing, there is this and that comes from India, there is this writing principle of starting a Dharma text by praising someone. And so some authors in India were using different kinds of praises. Some would address their praise to the Buddha, some would address this praise to the great bodhisattvas, so future Buddhas that are aiding us on the path. Sometimes the praise would be addressed to great compassion, or to bodhicitta itself, or to great wisdom, so all over the place. And then when Tibetans were translating different types of material into their language, they established a system according to which the praise that comes at the very beginning shows you which of the three primary categories of Buddhist texts a specific thing belongs to. But Geshe Chekawa actually does not follow that rule that was established by one of the Tibetan kings and his team of translators. and instead goes straight to the main point that this text is about. He praises great compassion. And as it tends to happen, this line can be read in multiple ways, and the two primary interpretations that we have here, one more obvious and important than the other kind of subsidiary, is that this can be seen as a praise to great compassion itself, to the quality of great compassion, or this can be seen as a praise to the Buddha who embodies great compassion. So Avalokiteshvara, who is seen as either a Buddha or a Bodhisattva, depending on the context. Sometimes we talk about Avalokiteshvara as a fully awakened Buddha, or even a trans-historical Buddha that is beyond time and has always existed, will always exist, is kind of the father and the mother of all Buddhas, is the source of all other Buddhas, and so forth. There's that. But sometimes we're seeing Avalokiteshvara as a Bodhisattva who is very, very advanced on the path, almost on the verge of awakening, but is holding back because of their unbearable compassion for all beings. So they gave this promise to not enter that final awakening until all beings are liberated. This second perception of Avalokiteshvara as a Bodhisattva who is hanging here for all of us not yet entering Buddhahood is quite widespread in the, roughly speaking, the far eastern, the Eastern Asian Buddhist tradition. So China, Japan, Vietnam, Korea, they have that perception of Avalokiteshvara, who there often appears as female. Princess Kuan Yin in China, Kannon in Japan, and so forth. But there's no shortage of practices, texts, and materials in which Avalokiteshvara is described as fully enlightened Buddha, or just an embodiment of universal compassion for all Buddhas, for all beings. And when this text is transmitted, it's also quite common to teach the practice of Avalokiteshvara, sometimes even to give an empowerment into that practice, but at least to offer some explanations with regards to how to visualize Avalokiteshvara, how to recite their mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, and sometimes more elaborate mantras and so forth. So we will look at that to a certain degree later in the course a little bit, because these types of practices where we do recite those mantras, we do use the visual imagery and so forth, can once again supercharge our analytical meditations on love, compassion, wisdom, and so forth, along with our concentration practices. So we will cover that itself as well. But when we use the primary interpretation of it actually meaning great compassion, not a Buddha of great compassion, but the great compassion itself, what it refers to then is a very specific form of our cognitive energy, our energy of desiring. So we have this ability to desire, and one wish that we can shape out of that energy is the wish for beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. That's the definition of compassion in the Buddhist tradition. Compassion is not simply suffering with someone, even though there is that stage in the practice where we feel someone suffering as if it were our own. Compassion is not pity. So looking at someone being like, oh, you poor soul, pobrecito, it's like, I don't know, poor you. It's also not simply sympathy or a sense of affinity. It's not the same as empathy either. It's not simply knowing what's happening to others or even experiencing their emotions to a certain degree. But it's a wish for beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering that then gets translated into action, compassionate action. Necessarily, in the long run at least. We first might be cultivating compassion cognitively, meditating on it, repeating those mental phrases, generating that intensity, but then it starts spontaneously pouring out of us. So when we see someone who is suffering, we do whatever we can to help them. And if we know there's nothing that we can do, we at least make long-term aspirations and plans and come up with different ideas on how to change the overall situation for everyone involved, even if we cannot fix the situation in the short run. So that's compassion in general. Wishing for a being to be free from suffering and its causes. And we all possess it as a natural potential to a certain degree. People with problems in terms of people who have different disorders related to sociopathy and psychopathy have less access to that part of their potential, sadly, and we don't fully know how that comes about, how to fix that, is it changeable, and so forth. But for most of us, if we are not there, we have a certain degree of compassion, or quite a lot of compassion available to us, at least towards our loved ones. So when we see our child suffering, our pet suffering, our friend suffering, or even if we're seeing someone distressed, crying in public transportation, our heart goes out to them. And that's why in the Pali tradition it's sometimes said that compassion is the quivering of the heart with regards to the vision of somebody else suffering. So there's something touched within us, and we're naturally reaching out, at least mentally, to soothe, to console, to help, to change the situation. So that's compassion in general. But when we are specifically training in compassion through meditation, we can develop it to the level at which it will be called immeasurable compassion. That's a very specific degree of having compassion. Measurable compassion is compassion that is equally intense towards all sentient beings and makes no distinctions between them in terms of these beings being more worthy of my compassion, these beings being less worthy of my compassion, these are my friends, so I'm going to be compassionate towards them, these are my enemies, quote unquote, I'm not going to be compassionate towards them. All of that disappears through training, and even though we do not lose track of the social conventions of, yes, needing to take care of our children first, our parents first, and so forth, the intensity of this inner wish becomes equal towards all beings. And it is often, ideally, is also supported by incredible degrees of concentration on that compassion, because compassion in the Buddhist tradition can be used as a samadhi practice, as a practice for cultivating single-pointed concentration. That's the way it's been traditionally taught by the Buddha himself. So that's immeasurable compassion, quite a step above what we have right now, but doable through very prolonged and intense training. And even if we spend not, let's say, 10,000 hours meditating on compassion, but 50, very doable. 100 hours meditating on compassion, 20 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Over time we've accumulated 50 hours, 100 hours. Will be very, very deeply transformative for the entirety of our mental well-being. But then beyond that, and we will move at least a tiny bit closer towards immeasurable compassion. But great compassion is something that lies beyond immeasurable compassion. It's not simply wishing for all beings to be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, but it's the state of a mind of a courageous bodhisattva, or a courageous hero of awakening. That's what bodhisattva literally means in the Tibetan version of that word, Jangchup Sempa. So it's a hero of awakening who not simply wants for all beings to be free from suffering, but actually takes the responsibility for that internally. So the great compassion is a compassion that says, may all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering, and I will make that happen. How's that supposed to happen? Well, the bodhisattva, through their practice, has fully gone beyond reductionist materialist view of the mind. They are fully aware of the fact that have limitless lives ahead of them. They also have a great mastery over the energy of their body and mind, in that they can reshape that energy as they go through these stages of rebirth. And in some cases, as they go along the path, they can manifest 100 bodies at the same time, 1,000 bodies. So that's the view of potential that is existent in the Tibetan tradition. We don't need to accept it as our own, but it's very important to play with it, to stretch the limits of what we see as truly possible for mind as this foundational energy that is a part of us. So from the bodhisattva point of view, their mind is incredibly powerful. It can manifest in multiple forms. It can be shaped into specific forms. And it has all the time in the world, and actually all the time in all the worlds, because even when this specific physical universe goes through the big crunch, which Buddhism does see as a viable explanation of how universes unfold and collapse, there are trillions of other universes that will still be inhabited by sentient beings, and all those beings will need help. But a bodhisattva, and then a Buddha, the final state on that path, has the entirety of time, and actually sees that time is illusory, and therefore can play around and help all beings in a very intense, powerful, and direct way to actually become free from suffering and the causes of suffering. So that's what great compassion is. So the natural, spontaneous taking of responsibility for all who live, that's what bodhisattvas have. And it's to that state of mind that Geshe Chekava is paying homage to, because that state of mind is the direct cause, or one of the two main causes for reaching awakening, becoming a Buddha, and therefore one of the most important things to cultivate in terms of our psychological development. So already that is showing us that, yeah, okay, I thought it was going to be like about changing my attitude to, maybe the annoying people in my life or whatever, or training my mind in terms of becoming more concentrated. And all that is there in the text as well. But why start on a humble note when you can first look at the great potential that we have, and then slowly, slowly progress there. When great master Nyoshul Khen Rinpoche would teach in the West, and when he would have one-on-one interviews with Western disciples, American disciples in particular, he would always be a bit surprised by how kind of limiting or limited their views of their potential were, which is kind of ironic in a way, right? Because we're talking about American students, and there is that push for, in American Dharma, I've experienced that a lot, for people to get the highest teachings as soon as possible. You know, give me the deepest teaching already. You know, I don't have time for this, you know, like flirty stuff or, you know, basic. Give me the deepest teaching that you have, and in the fastest way possible. Give me the most efficient thing that you have. So there's that, absolutely. But at the same time, naturally, through our acculturation, naturally through our conditioning, there's a very limiting view of the potential that we have. And therefore, even though we love teachings about Buddha nature and how at the very core of our being we are radiant luminosity that is empty, spacious, and boundless, we kind of don't really buy into that, because we've been taught that we're, I don't know, sinners if we come more from the Judeo-Christian tradition, or a pile of meat that is driven by Freudian instincts, if we've been more conditioned by the materialist view of reality. Certainly not luminous emptiness that is boundless. You know, that's not our view of who we are. Therefore, we are paying homage to that great potential. And then to arrive at that great potential, the first line in point 1 teaches us the preliminaries. So the preliminaries is an interesting word, because when we hear it in our languages, we think, well, that's probably for, you know, babies, right? For people who are kind of not advanced. And I'm obviously advanced, because I've been doing yoga for 3 months. So, or studying Buddhism for 40 years, whatever. You know, we think that whatever it is that we did probably means that we are already there. So let's go to point 2. But actually, the word preliminaries here can also be translated as preparation. And the most helpful analogy is to think of an Olympic athlete. So all the training that an Olympic athlete undergoes, and we know how emotionally abusive it might be, but like, let's ignore that for a moment and just think about the intensity of the training and years or decades of training that go into becoming a brilliant gymnast or swimmer or figure skater or whatever. You know, people start very young and they spend, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of hours perfecting the response of each muscle to each specific movement that needs to be undertaken. And then they have those 3 minutes in which they need to perform perfectly at the actual Olympics. You know, if it's a figure skater, they have 3 minutes for their free skate. So we come to the Dharma. It's so funny. We come to the Dharma and we say, no, 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 no. You don't understand. I want to go straight to the free skate. I'm going to do those 3 minutes of glory. I'm going to give them everything that I'm going to do those, you know, toe loops and everything. And of course, when the masters of this discipline hear this, the actual masters, they're like, what are you talking about? You don't know how to skate. You don't even know how to put the skating equipment on. You've never been on ice. What are you talking about? We're like, no, 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 no. You don't get it. So it kind of becomes this kind of struggle. And then we think that the preliminaries are already done by us because they are conceptually simple. One of them is to think about the fact that we're mortal. Yeah, okay, big deal, I'm mortal, let's move on. But what they mean is we need to contemplate it and meditate it until the point where our complete perception of reality is transformed irrevocably, and in each given moment of each given day, we are always aware of the fact that we might die in the next 3 seconds. What we think it means is, okay, I'm mortal, big deal, you know, everyone dies one day. Whereas emotionally we feel, I'm going to live forever. Or we think, oh, no, I'm not going to live forever, I'm going to kill myself next week. But that's also not what they're encouraging us to do either. It's not that. Because before that comes the first contemplation there. So the line itself says, train first in the preliminaries. Okay, that's kind of saying, don't do your Olympic performance until you've spent all these decades of training doing these preliminary stages. And then, although the preliminaries are sometimes described in a more elaborate manner here, where They basically tell us to meditate all the stages of the graduated path to awakening. The more quintessentialized approach, which is followed here in these annotated notes, is to contemplate 4 themes that are actually foundational for the Buddhist worldview and are shared by some of the other Dharmic traditions as well. There's quite a lot of overlap with, broadly speaking, the Hindu tradition, or the Hindu traditions, because we know it's not one thing. It's multiple different branches of seeing reality and practicing. There's a lot of overlap with the Christian tradition, the Sufi tradition, and so forth. But Buddhism kind of course, describes these 4 points in a unique way. And the first of these that we really need to embody deeply is the precious human rebirth. The theme of precious human rebirth, which is basically a reminder, very kind reminder, first from the Buddha and then from the subsequent generations of masters, that this current configuration of matter, energy, and mind energy that we are, that we label as me, that we associate with our name, with our personal history, with a passport, with an ID and so forth, is not simply a pile of meat or chemical scum or whatever it is that we use to describe humans. It's not simply, a 2-legged animal that walks around and humps stuff and, eats stuff and poops and so forth. It's not simply all that. For us specifically, for people who have the fortune of reading this text or hearing about the Dharma in general, this specific configuration of matter and energy, of matter and mind, material energy and mental energy, is an incredible jewel that is so rare that anyone else who's not us would pay trillions of dollars to have this, if people were aware of all of this stuff. But they can't, because you cannot actually buy it with money. And beings invest trillions dollars worth of good karma into getting this specific type of body and these specific circumstances and this specific mental disposition that we have right now, so as to progress along these stages of the path, get awakening and so forth. And that's what we did in the past. In our past lives, to receive this specific configuration of mental and material energy, we needed to have created bucket loads of very positive energetic potential, positive karma, then configured it through specific practices of making aspiration prayers and so forth. And then we waited patiently on our ass, waiting to be reborn at this unique intersection of different factors where we would have the freedom to practice the Dharma and the different supportive conditions. So it's usually described as a combination of freedoms and endowments. So things that are good and freedom from things that are bad. A unique intersection of all of these conditions is what a precious human rebirth is. And we have received that. But now, being largely unaware of the fact that we have it, we're just blissing out and also thinking about killing ourselves perhaps because, yeah, no big deal, I didn't ask to get born and so forth. Whereas everyone else, including these great bodhisattvas around us, are looking at us like this and saying, what are you talking about? What's happening? Hello, you've spent trillions of lifetimes moving up to this very unique point. And this is, once again, a modern day analogy. Let's say that for 50 years, we were begging Bill Gates to give us, for one day, his credit card, which, as you can imagine, unlimited money. It's virtual money, it doesn't exist. It's like, there's not enough cash in the world to actually, for him to cash out fully. But what it means is if he gives us a card to us, we can buy anything we want. We can build buildings with it. He's rich enough to, buy everything. So he gives us to us for one day. But then we suffer from amnesia. And then we are sitting there and we're thinking, this is a piece of plastic. I cannot even use it as toilet paper. It's completely useless. I can bend it like this, or I can break it. That's it. Like, what good is this? And we're sitting there and being completely oblivious to the fact that this thing can be used to literally buy everything that money can buy. So the same thing with our body, and that's actually with our unique human rebirth. It said that this human rebirth can be used to buy the ultimate thing that can be bought in a way, or attained or accomplished, and that's liberation and full awakening, 2 highest goals on the Buddhist path. The minimum that we can attain with this is to get another one like this, another rebirth like this, another cool rebirth here, or in the pure dimension we'll progress very quickly towards full awakening. Or if we're really diligent, we can become fully realized in this very life. Or at least we can get partial realization, which would be completely mind-blowingly different from what we are right now. We will be literally living in a state of permanent luminous clarity, endowed with loving kindness, no garbage thoughts, no depression, no anything. You know, complete lightness of being that would be so powerfully radiating from us that when others encounter us, they would be like, oh my God, I can see this as a holy being. Can I please hang out with them? That's literally what it's like to be with great yogis. They are gateways into that luminous clarity that's deep within. So that can be attained through having this precious human rebirth. But we're bending the plastic hard and thinking, okay, I'll just wait until it crumbles or I'll break it, but that's all I can do with it, because we're not aware of the incredible potential that is inherent in this. And that's where we're encouraged to meditate on the preciousness of this human rebirth. And that can be done in two ways, essentially. In a more elaborate traditional way, where we would go through a list of very specific freedoms that we have, very specific endowments that we have. For example, the freedom from being born as an animal, the freedom from being born as a perpetually hungry ghost that just floats around and craves for stuff but never gets satisfied, and so forth. Or freedom from being born in a barbaric land where there's no access to any dharmic tradition whatsoever. You know, some society that is completely materialistic and gives people no access to spirituality at all. So all of these sorts of things, freedom from that. And then endowments, being able to live in a stage, in a cosmic era where there are actual dharmic teachings present in the world, where there are actual teachers transmitting all of this stuff, and supportive communities that we can come together with and be like, hey, what are we doing on Friday? Oh, let's study some attitude training. We will go out for a pint later, but first let's study some attitude training. So how incredible is that? You know, it's a completely rare opportunity to have that. And of course, there's a lot of, we can add from our side, there's a lot of privilege that goes into simply living in a safe country where we're free to exercise our political will and to vote and to read Dharma books, you know, and to post whatever we want at social media within reasonable boundaries and so forth. So it's like incredible, you know, and you know, I have personal experience of living in a completely opposite condition. And so just enjoying that, but really in meditation, in analytical meditation, allowing that to penetrate our heart. But even if we don't go through point by point, a simpler form of meditating on that is to simply sit and think in meditation once we have relaxed our body and mind. I'm free from all these conditions that would prevent me from having access to these dharmic teachings and from being able to practice them. I'm free from physical limitations that would completely make me unable to practice. I'm free from political limitations. I'm free from emotional limitations because I have enough emotional freedom at least to look at this. Oh, is it going to help? You know, and I have all these endowments. I have these wonderful opportunities to use all that. I have enough money to, you know, have access to the internet. That's all it takes to practice Dharma these days. You know, if you have access to the internet, you have access to all the Dharma in the world. You don't need to travel to India like these great translators of the past did, or like Atisha did. You don't need to wait 100 years for Atisha to come to Tibet and then deliver some teachings and then pass away there, and then hunt for some Lama who would still be holding that lineage of transmission. You can literally, it's all there at the tip of your fingertips. And when you're doing different types of, for example, the physical yogas of Buddhism, so-called prostrations, let's say, you can do them on beautiful wooden floors where you can slide on very comfortably, whereas some of the masters of the past did it on, you know, stone and in cold environments and would not have an opportunity to shower for multiple months because that's what life in Tibet was. So we have this incredible leisure, and we need to keep reminding ourselves that Bill Gates gave us this card for one day only. And that's the second thought there, death and impermanence. We do have this incredible jewel of a temporary configuration of body and mind, but it's gonna end. And this is where we can play around with guided meditations and with meditation practices related to death and impermanence. And Tibetans have a specific way of meditating in death and impermanence, and that's kind of a nice note to end on. Thinking of our impermanence so that we can stay motivated to continue this exploration eventually. 3 thoughts that we bring to mind in analytical meditation, and we'll have a guided meditation on the page with all the materials so that you can comfortably, instead of me trying to squeeze it into the last minute, you can comfortably sit down and meditate on that using the guided practice and see how it feels. That will give us something to discuss next time. So 3 thoughts would be brought there into our mind. First, the thought that our death is inevitable. And then that's where we are told, well, everyone who's been born eventually died. There's no exceptions. There's no John Smith that was born and then didn't die. And the only 2 objections that we have is, well, what about Jesus? Well, he still died, even if he's then, came alive again. There was a moment of dying, right? So, and also you're not Jesus. And so don't be too optimistic just because he did it. If you can die and come back to life 3 days later, once again, kudos. Otherwise, consider your life final. It's going to end. But if not that, in the Buddhist tradition, we'll sometimes say, well, in the Tibetan tradition, there are these incredible masters, and that's shared with the Chinese tradition as well, actually. There's these masters who, through incredible practice, were able to transform into a so-called body of light, rainbow body, and there's different names for these specific achievements. What about them? Well, and once again, first of all, there's still that moment of transformation where kind of their mortal life ends and then that next stage begins. Even if it's kind of a smooth continuum of them transforming into that, their mortal life ends to a certain degree, and then there's that next level of evolution. So if you can arrive at that in one lifetime, and some exceptional individuals can, and still to this day, there's prophecies by great masters of the past, including Padmasambhava, about how even in our day and age, there will be at least 100 people who will attain the highest type of rainbow body through incredible practice. Totally possible. But let's really seriously consider, do we think that we are in that highest category? And the trick there is, even if we are there, it's actually helpful to think of us in more humble terms. Like, no, I really need to do all the hard work and think that I might die next week or in the next moment. Because that will motivate me to practice, actually. So even though they are kind of exceptions, not really exceptions, better not to focus on them, but think about all the people we know who have passed away. And they did pass away, for sure. So a similar thing will happen to me. So my mortality is a fact. It's a given. And I need to think about it until it really penetrates the depths of my being. And not to get depressed, that's a completely wrong conclusion there. Not to become afraid of the fact of dying itself, also wrong conclusion. But to really appreciate the time and space and the opportunities that I have right now to push myself into milking as much benefit out of it as possible. And the way to milk it in a good way is not to get as much hedonic pleasure as possible, even though there's nothing wrong with having some physical pleasures, sensory pleasures, and so forth, but to especially cultivate the profound well-being of the mind, samyak sukha, sat sukha, because that will go with us when our mind moves on. And the second point in that sequence, after we've established that our death is inevitable, is to think the time of dying is unknown. Sometimes it's translated as undetermined, but that's kind of not what's meant. It's not that there's yet not determination when is it going to happen, and then one day someone will come in and say, well, die now, and then it's determined. It's not that. It's that maybe if we were with a truly great yogi like Garchen Rinpoche, they would know that we only have 3 weeks left. When Garchen Rinpoche was a little boy, he's a reincarnate lama. So some of those lamas carry very strong powers from their past lives, because like a reincarnate lama is a very broad term that can cover very, very different stages of accomplishment. But Garchen Rinpoche is an exceptional being, and when he was little, he could very easily and very accurately predict people's deaths. And then his father, who was his teacher, one day smacked him on the head and said, "Don't say that. What are you doing? You're not it's like, don't do that." So he stopped doing that. So now when he's in your presence, he doesn't tell you those things. Even though probably his perception hasn't changed. He can look in you and he can see, like 10 years, 20 years, 3 months, 3 days, something like that. He just doesn't want us to get too scared, because we just freak out when we hear those things, unless we're truly transformed practitioners already. But for us, we don't know. It might be 3 minutes later when we're having that, might be an hour later, we're having that pint, and we croak and die. Totally. Happens all the time. But it could be 85 years from now or more. We might want to be one of those people living this planet because we've completely destroyed it and moving to Mars for a little while and hanging out there, still practicing Dharma, hopefully, but we don't know. So We don't know, and therefore it's best to act as if we're going to die the next moment, or tomorrow, or today, or tonight, rather than thinking, oh no, I have 85 years ahead of me, I'll practice the Dharma in that last year of my life. And then the third thought, very important here, it's kind of the final accord, is that at the time of death, only Dharma will help. Only Dharma will help. And Dharma, of course, is a very general term. There are multiple forms of Dharma. Dharma generally, in terms of etymology, can be translated as that which holds us from suffering, because the Sanskrit rudra can mean to hold, and therefore sometimes Dharma means phenomena, that which phenomenon, that which holds its properties. But Dharma with a capital D is that which holds us from suffering, or to use the definition once given by Geshe Namang Dargye, who was a great 20th century scholar, Dharma is a way of life, a way of looking towards, looking at reality that brings us lasting, genuine well-being. So there are multiple dharmas, therefore there's multiple forms of Hindu dharma, there's Buddhist dharma, multiple forms of Buddhist dharma, Christian dharma, the dharma of secular ethics, and multiple other systems that can make us better people who are more happy. The dharma of cognitive behavioral therapy, that's a thing, in a way. We don't use those words, but it's what it is. It helps us transform our mind. So along the same lines, something that is transforming for our mental experience is this Dharma, and this Dharma can lead us to greater well-being. And especially at the moment of death, what's not going to be of help is our body, because it's collapsing, it's dying. It's useless to appeal to it and be like, no, help me, it's dying. The body is the thing that's dying, so it's useless. Our relatives are not going to be helpful either, and most likely they're actually going to be extremely unhelpful, because they're going to be freaking out all around us, therefore making us panic, and that's not going to be good for the moment of death. Our wealth is useless, because what are you going to do? Bribe death? That's not how it works. Best medical care in the world, yes, it can help to a certain degree, so let's not disregard that, but there is a limitation to how much modern medicine can prolong our life. So at the end of the day, someone will turn off that, machine for us, because we know, there's only so much that we can do. And yes, they can still freeze us, which is what some, billionaires are exploring. What if I get frozen and 300 years from now they're going to unfreeze me and heal? Good luck with that. But for most of us, that's going to be a moment of death. And the only thing that will happen in that moment is the Dharma, meaning all the practice that we've accomplished, and especially for those of us who train for that, the special practices for the moment of dying itself. This text contains very detailed instructions on what to do at the moment of our death, to transform the moment of our death into at least an opportunity to get a good rebirth, or, if we are more advanced, to gain direct realization of the nature of reality, quickly become an advanced bodhisattva, progress towards full awakening, yada, yada, yada. So death can be used in that way, and Tibetan tradition in particular has lots of teachings and practices specifically for that. They're contained to a certain degree in this text, and we're going to look at them. But at least we can think the Dharma of loving kindness, the Dharma of compassion, the Dharma of wisdom, or even the humble repetitions of Mani Padme Hum that I've done, or Hail Mary, or whatever. All of those spiritual types of practice will help me at the moment of death. But not my wealth, not my body, not my reputation, not my Instagram, not my whatever else. Only the things that were inner, and that were good and wholesome in nature, and that I hopefully will also have a chance to activate consciously by revisiting my spiritual practice as I'm passing away. So with all of that, okay, I'm motivated to use this precious human rebirth that is like Bill Gates's bank card, but more precious, infinitely more precious, to make something meaningful out of my own life, to be happy, more happy right now. That's one aim of these teachings, and to then get some benefits that are beyond this life. And that's not a theoretical idea of, well, maybe somewhere in post-mortem state something good is waiting for me. This text will offer very precise instructions on what will happen at the moment of death, how to use that, how to gain good things after that moment of dying, and so forth. So we'll hopefully look at all of that if at least one of you comes back next time, or if someone else pops in. But beyond that, these are nice thoughts to live this class with. One is this idea that we are actually living in an incredibly valuable human body with these incredible opportunities, and we really need to, bliss out about that. Trillions of positive karmic seeds went into fueling this for us. And therefore, we can do incredible things with it. We can transform the entire world. We can become awakened, yada, yada, yada. But at the same time, it's finite in that we will die. And therefore, we need to do two things. We need to live in a meaningful way, and we need to train for the moment of death, because that will really give us loads of opportunities to become enlightened right there and then. So if we do that, we become good attitude benders already. And the two further things to consider, the second half of this part, behavioral cause and effect and disadvantages of samsara, is what we will begin the next session with, because of course it takes some time to talk about Buddhist theory of karma and how it relates to our behavior and so forth. So we'll do that, and that's the cliffhanger that I'm going to leave you with. But before we fully conclude, another part of this tradition is to spend a few moments thinking of all the positive constructive seeds that we've accumulated in our own mind. Beautiful seeds of learning about compassion, learning about the fact that our attitudes are changeable, we can transform them. Hearing about these great masters of the past, meditating on loving kindness, all of that. May we nourish these seeds, and may they ripen to bring greatest possible benefit to ourselves and all beings. And especially may they deliver ourselves and all beings to full awakening. So with this aspiration, we conclude. So wishing you a beautiful night and hoping to see some of you again. Thank you. Oh yes, and if you the text are yours.